Good afternoon. My name is Samuel Calvin Still III, and I am the second great grandnephew of Dr. James Still, and also the nephew of William Still, who was the father of the Underground Railroad. And they had a brother named Peter Still that was a slave for over 40 years and was able to buy his freedom and reunite with his family. Peter Still, as I said earlier, was left in slavery. And soon after his mother left him, as they typically did in those days with slaves. They would sell them off. If your family member left, many times that slave owner would sell the kids off or sell the family off because they realized that family that would be free, especially in the border states, would come back and try to rescue their family. So Peter and Levin was sold off to Kansas, and during that period of time that they were in bondage, Levin died later on, and he was treated pretty poorly when he went out to Kansas. He was whipped a few times. He was beaten pretty badly. But Peter survived. And Peter's story to me is always fascinating because Peter ended up in Alabama, down in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And what's interesting about his story was that Peter became very talented. He ended up becoming very skilled at what he was doing. Like he learned how to make shoes. He learned how to tailor. He learned how to, different things because he was being farmed out to all these different tradespeople. Because understand back then, most of our skilled labor were slaves. They were enslaved Africans, especially down south. They were your carpenters. They were your blacksmiths. They did all the heavy lifting. So Peter ended up becoming friends with, I won't say friends, but he ended up working for all these different people later on as he got older. Because as he got older, he really wasn't a good field hand anymore because he had skills. So he starts paying attention to the different people he was working for. And he realized he got working for these two Jewish merchants that set up shop in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And they weren't very liked in the community. But in listening to them talk and him working with them, he realized that they really weren't really keen about slavery. But in Alabama and a lot of your southern states, you couldn't free your slaves. And in order to get labor, you hired out enslaved Africans. Well, Peter recognized that these two Jewish merchants weren't really cool about it, but I guess in Rome, you do what the Romans do. Well, he got talking to them, and he said to them, would you buy me? If you could purchase me, because he worked out a deal with him, and they were like, yeah, Peter, we'll do it. And Peter was worried because a lot of times people would say things and go against what they said. And the other side of it is that Peter was able to go in and out of this town because he would mend people's shoes. He would get hand-me-downs from the whites in the area that would give him stuff they were throwing out. He'd fix it up, take it back to the plantations, and he would exchange that stuff for produce. And he would bring the produce back into town and he would sell it. So he was able to do this and make some money on the side, and that was okay on the weekends to do. He was able to do that. So when he got these two Jewish merchants, and he said to them, I think my owner might be okay with the price of $500. And they were like, okay, we'll approach them. So they were able to buy Peter. But what they didn't know that Peter already had saved up like $300. So the night that they purchased him, he came into their office and said, here's $300 down on the $500 I owe you. So he worked for them for another year, and they packed up and moved up to Ohio and set Peter free. And he actually became pretty close friends with them later on. So Peter now is free, and he travels into Philadelphia, like I spoke earlier, and he meets William Still, and he starts telling the story, and lo and behold, it's like, you're my brother. But soon after he became free and was reunited with his family, his eyes and his focus turned back to, what about my wife and children in Alabama? So he actually travels back to Alabama, disguising himself that he was still a slave. And if you read the book that's written about him, called The Kidnapped and the Ransomed, he writes about the people that the whites that he was friends with. They were like, you still working for the Jewish merchants? Man, that's horrible. We'll buy you back so you can come back and live here because you don't want to work for those guys. And he was like, no, I'm okay. I like where I'm at. They didn't even know that he was free. So he goes back, he meets his wife and says, look, give me a piece of your dress. Give me a piece of clothing. And when you get this piece of cloth back, you'll know that the person that gives it to you, it came from me. So he travels back 1,600 miles back to Philadelphia. And lo and behold, there's this gentleman named Seth Conklin who says that I always kind of see him as an adventurer. Like he would just take on different things. He wasn't really an abolitionist. He really wasn't a military person. He read about Peter's story and he decided to say, hey, I'll help. What can I do? And they were like, okay. Him, Peter, Seth, and William got together. And the plan was that he would travel back down to Alabama. He would help escape Peter's wife and children. Her name was Vina. And he goes back to Alabama. He hands her this piece of cloth. And she recognizes it. So then he takes her. And unfortunately, they get caught along the Columbia River going back up. They get caught. She gets thrown back in shackles. And Seth Conklin is handcuffed and beaten to death and kicked off into the river and drowns. They find his body weeks later. So now what do you do, Peter? Now what do you do? So the slave owner, which is really, in all these letters that's in the Underground Railroad book, the slave owner writes back to Peter and says, if you want your family back, how about $5,000 to get your family back? Now, $5,000 a day could be hard even today. I can't imagine the feeling of having to come up with $5,000 when you're uneducated, you don't have a job, But what Peter ends up doing, he travels all up through the Northeast. He meets Harriet Beecher Stowe. He meets Reverend Mays. He meets William Lloyd Garrison. He meets all these heavyweights in the abolitionist movement. And they let him speak at churches and different organizations. And he talks about how bad slavery was. And he raised money that way. So from 1850 to 1855, Peter was able to raise the $5,000. And that's just, I'm just giving you the tidbit of the story because there's more twists and turns before he even got to that point. But in 1855, he was able to raise enough money to buy his family and bring them back here to Burlington. He actually moved to Burlington Township, what we would call Burlington Township now. He had a farm and a produce, and he took produce back and forth to market. That's how he was able to make his money. And that's Peter's story. And I say the book is called The Kidnapped and the Ransomed, the recollections of Peter and Vina Still, and that is the movie. That movie makes no disrespect to the Northrop family, Solomon Northrop family of the 12 Years a Slave. Peter's movie or life would be just as monumental, or even more, when you really go through and you read the book. And when you read the book that the woman who wrote it, Kate Picard, wrote it, you just get to see, you see the scenes, you feel it. And it's just such an amazing story in a life.
We really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm sure there's many of us that will want to know how we can trace back to our genealogy. How do we do that in easy steps?
Well, I think it starts with, and this might sound cliche, but it starts with, almost nowadays, with Ancestry.com. Because there's so much information on there. But you have to understand the clues that you run into, you have to cross-check them and cross-reference them. Because sometimes the census reports will have, as African Americans, sometimes they make a mistake and have us listed as being white. Or if we're mixed, mulatto. So you have to understand how to check that. Ancestry.com is a good starting place. But once you start getting into and trying to get an outline, you have to start getting into the real archives where you find the marriage certificates, death certificates. A lot of times on death certificates, they will say, died on this day, wife or spouse was this person, mother and father was this name, this person, born here. And once you get to those archives, then the other archives that as African Americans, because prior to the Civil War, we were property. The truth about it, we were property. So a lot of times, like my third great grandfather Levin, he was willed to a young man that became an orphan. So when he became an orphan, he had his caregiver or guardian had to submit records of how he earned money, if he earned money. So there's line items where it says, Negro boy Levin made $1,500 for the year. Checking plantation owners' wills, because a lot of times in their wills, they willed their property to family members. So like if you had a great whatever grandmother, her name was Sid or Nan, it might be listed in the will as, well, I bequeath my Negro boy Levin to my son John whatever. And that's how you kind of trace them back. And then you can get deeper into the fact that if you do your DNA, there are different DNA tests. Now, I've only done the quick and dirty ones, which are like my heritage and other things like that, and my 21.com or whatever it is. But there are other ones that will break down your X and Y chromosomes. Your Y chromosome supposedly traces your male of your father all the way back to, I don't know, like 10 or 15, whatever levels. And the Y, the X is your mother's. So with African Americans, if you can tie in and do some more tests where they take your DNA and compare it to pools of people that they've taken in certain parts of Africa, you can kind of get a sense of what area your family might have came from. You'll find that there's records on the transatlantic slave voyages. Understand that again, we were cargo, we were property. Well, they took documents on the ship that, shipping companies had certain ports that they went to. They just didn't travel up and down the west coast of Africa picking up people. They had ports they had to go to. So they would take their cargo and go from here to Haiti, where they would clean people up, feed them, get them healthy again, then take them over to Havana to sell them. And then from there they came into the US. So I would say you got to get into the archives, you got to check your census reports, you got to check your marriage certificates, your death certificates, and a lot of African Americans think that we have Native American blood in us. Well, everybody, grandma had straight hair. What I think you're going to find out is that a lot of us just have white European blood in us. There's not, and I've learned this from watching Henry Louis Gates' show, and I've learned it by just reading up on the material. And you'll find that a lot of us have Europeans in them. I've run into whites who have said, all my life I thought I was Native American. I did my DNA and here I'm 10% black. Come to find out, that my grandfather had slept with his slave and then killed the woman afterwards and brought the child into the household and told everybody the baby was Native American. You'll find those kind of stories. But to start with Ancestry.com and those type of things, go to your churches, check your Bibles, get the stories from your aunts and your uncles. But even those stories, you have to check them because the stories get embellished over time. So you have to go back and check. But I strongly believe our ancestors left bloodstains or breadcrumbs for us to follow. And we just have to take time to look for them.